Thank you so much, Polis. I want to also thank all of you in the audience for attending this session. It's my pleasure to share with you some of the ideas that I've had in my career in science. But before doing so, I especially want to thank Polis Yarosevich and Petros Venias for directly getting me involved to come here to Lithuania, my first visit, actually. Also, I'd like to pay respects, of course, to Anna Wigmore, who started this movement from Lithuania, as well as to Viktor Kovinskis, his partner, who is here with us today. My journey in this field has been in science. I have spent most of my career at Cornell University. I am, if you will, sort of within the scientific establishment. And so my journey, as I got involved in this idea, came from a place that was, I would suggest, exactly the opposite of what I now believe to be true. And so it's been a lot of fun going through science and challenging, if you will, what we tend to think about when we do scientific research. And I find it really quite exciting that now today, as I went through science with my particular journey, that I end up in the same place, I think, to a great extent, with what Anne Wigmore has started many years ago. I want to talk about the science of nutrition, especially the concept of wholesomeness. And so I'm going to tell my story, beginning with my personal background, as I said, which is really quite different than what it is today. This is myself in earlier years, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I'm not sure. And it was on a farm. I was milking cows at the time, doing typical farm work, drinking lots of milk, consuming the animals that we produce to some extent, collecting eggs. The typical farm life that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I then went away to school eventually at Cornell University to do my graduate work, doing degrees and my master's and doctoral work at Cornell. And there, being in the Department of Animal Science at Cornell University, I worked on a thesis or dissertation that was addressed to the question concerning how we might be able to produce animal-based protein, which is generally considered the highest quality protein, to use those words, to produce animal protein more effectively and efficiently so we could consume more animal protein. I think you can see the sort of dichotomy that exists between those two ideas. So that was my background, actually. And then one of my first positions was at Virginia Tech University in Virginia, where I, with my senior colleague, organized a nationwide program for feeding malnourished children in the Philippines. As you know, many poor countries in the world have quite a lot of children who are in distress and who are not getting enough nutrition. So we went to the Philippines, in fact, to set up sort of living centers around or mothercraft centers around the country in order to educate mothers to help them be able to improve the health of their children. And in that effort, we were concerned about the fact that these children were not getting enough protein, as well as enough energy. And so not getting enough protein was, in fact, very consistent with what I had been taught and what I, in turn, was teaching to my students early on. So it was, basically it was emphasizing the consumption of protein from my personal background as well as my professional background that sort of established my early career. When in the Philippines, though, we were surveying to see how much protein was being consumed by various families, being much less than in the United States. However, there were a few families in the Philippines, the richer families, if you will, a few families in the Philippines who were consuming levels of protein that were similar to what we do in the West. And so we wanted to basically raise the level of protein consumption in the poor families as well. But then I learned something that really challenged my thinking. At first, I couldn't quite believe it, but I did listen to it. It was the idea that those few families who consumed the most protein were the families who appeared to me to be the ones whose children, in some cases, were more susceptible to getting liver cancer. And so that was an idea that, as I say, was very strange. More protein, more liver cancer, especially in children, didn't make sense to me at first. And then I saw this particular publication here. That was a study of experimental animals in India, where they reported that when they fed animals that had been preconditioned to get liver cancer because of their exposure to a chemical carcinogen, when these animals were fed 2 different levels of protein, these investigators hypothesized that the animals who got the least protein would be more susceptible to getting the liver cancer. In reality, they got the opposite effect. You can see here from this presentation that the animals fed the higher levels of protein, the 20% protein, 20% of total energy. I'm sorry about this jiggling. Can we get that sort of straight? The higher levels of protein, 20% of total energy, compared to the animals fed the lower levels of protein. The higher protein animals were the ones who actually were, in fact, growing the cancers, which was, I say, was exactly the opposite what we thought in the beginning, but it was consistent with what I thought I was saying in the families with the children. Higher protein, more cancer. Then that started research of ours in my laboratory that was actually funded for many years, for 27 years actually, funding from the U.S. government for the most part. I started research. I wanted to know that because this observation was so provocative, more protein, more cancer, because it was such a provocative and unexpected observation, I wanted to know if this is true. I wanted to be able to repeat those studies. But even more importantly, I wanted to be able to understand, how does that work? Because if it's true, we want to know what are the so-called mechanisms by which this occurs. So I'm going to share with you just a few slides here to show you some of the more interesting points, more significant points. If you can bear with me then on this, we started this study, long series of experiments over 27 years to see whether high protein actually increased cancer. Here is one display of what happens in the first 12 weeks when the cancers begin to grow in these animals. The animals are fed 2 different levels of protein, 20% of total energy, which is considered to be the desirable levels, as opposed to the 5% animals. And you can see here that when these animals are genetically programmed to get the cancer and then fed these 2 different levels, the animals fed the 20% protein, actually these cancers are growing. When animals fed the 5%, they are not. Then we followed up to do a series of different experiments to see what might happen if, in fact, we change the level of protein. And so this is a representation of one of those kinds of experiments where if we feed 20% protein diets in the first 3 weeks, you can see those cancers begin to grow. If, in contrast, we switch the diet to 5%, we turn the cancers off. We switch it back to 20%, we turn it on. Back to 5%, we turn it off. What we could do, and this was very exciting, what this demonstrated was that cancer tends to grow according to the nutritional experience, if you will. This is the first time this had been shown. I did not know whether it appeared, it also existed for other cancers as well, but it does, I should tell you. This was an exciting proposition that maybe cancer is a function, let's say, of nutrient intake, in this particular case, of protein intake. So it gave us a lesson that I was to carry through my career. Namely, nutrition controls cancer growth. So that begs the question, what do we mean by nutrition? What kind of nutrients are we talking about? Which kind of foods are we talking about? In those days, and still these days, many people think that cancer is caused by either chemical carcinogens, the chemicals that we get exposed to in our environment and through our food and water. Maybe some cancers might be caused by viruses, and that's incidentally true. There are a couple of viruses that do, in fact, have been demonstrated to cause cancer. Or perhaps cancer is caused by genes, which means cancer in our family background is going to determine whether or not we actually get the cancer. What the demonstration that we did in the laboratory was to show that maybe nutrition is a factor in controlling cancer. As I say, a very exciting concept. So we proceeded ahead with that idea that nutrition could cause cancer, especially regarding protein. Now, in this particular slide here, I'm showing a sort of schematic representation of the relationship between the genetic cause of cancer as opposed to the nutritional cause of cancer. And in this particular scheme, you can see that in this, if we start, for example, with normal cells, and then we create some cancer cells through various procedures, and create lots of cancer cells in this side here. Over here, we create just a few cancer cells. And then if the diet remains the same, you can see the situation where we start with more cancer cells, we get more tumors, obviously. This leads to the idea that genes cause cancer, which is reasonable. All of our pathological events, all of our diseases, and normal health responses, everything essentially starts with genes. So genes are important, clearly. They are the basis. They are the template, for what is to happen. And so in this case, as I say, we can claim that genes cause cancer. However, it turns out, as the last slide I showed you, that even though we may have lots of cancer initiated in theory, on the other hand, if we just simply sort of change our diet, then we don't grow these cancers. This is an exciting concept because it shows something quite different than genes simply causing cancer. In this case, nutrition controls genes, which in turn controls cancer. So nutrition is acting to control the expression, as we say in science. It controls the expression of the genes to cause the response. So then we turned our attention to, among other things, to the question concerning what kind of protein does this. Do all proteins do this kind of response? The protein that we were using was the same protein that most of us in research had been using in those days for these kind of experiments. It was a protein that was readily available. It was the main protein of cow's milk. And so this is why I showed you the story in the beginning of my having been raised on a farm, milking cows, because for me, this was quite a shock. It was very different than what I would have expected. The main protein of cow's milk actually was turning on the cancer. We tried a couple of other proteins soy protein, and wheat protein. Those proteins did not increase this early cancer development, even when they were fed at the 20% level of total calories. So we saw in this particular case something that, pictures that started to emerge. An animal-based protein had the property of increasing the cancer growth. 2 plant proteins did not. And this was an exciting opportunity, too, to expand on this idea as the years went ahead. There is a difference between what animal proteins do and what plant proteins do. So we have, if you will, a lesson, at least a lesson for me. Nutrients of animal-based foods function differently from nutrients of plant-based foods. Another lesson that became kind of fixed for many other kinds of experiments as well. So now I want to tell you a little bit about still another observation. As I went through my research career, I kept seeing things from time to time that were actually very different from what I had been taught and what I in turn were teaching my students. And it was these heresies, if you will, that actually began to shape for me a different way of thinking. And so here's one more observation that was a lesson. Namely, if we look at the development of cancer, and that was one of my main interests in the early days, if you look at the development of cancer over time, you can see here that, and this is the way we tend to think about cancer in experimental research. If you think about it, the cancer starts out early on in a process called initiation. This is when the chemical comes in and intercepts the gene, causes a mutation, and actually can convert a normal cell to cancer. So it's a starting point. So initiation is a starting point. It's a complex procedure, by the way. So it's the early stage, just creating those cells that are capable of causing cancer. Then, of course, we go into a second stage, much longer period of time, where these cancers begin to grow. They begin to divide. This is the stage called promotion. And so we have these first 2 stages, and then finally the last stage is the stage during which, in theory, someone may have discovered they have a problem, and they may, in fact, be diagnosed with a disease. We call that progression. So let's think of 3 different stages. I wanted to know, and this is what we do in science, I wanted to know, especially for this particular case, protein causing cancer, I wanted to know what was the mechanism by which this works, which enzyme might be involved, which event maybe involving hormones or involving some transport across cell membranes, which event accounted for this? Because if we could determine what was the specific mechanism by which this occurs, then in theory, according to Western medicine, if we knew that, then we could make a drug or make a chemical that would stop that reaction. That's the idea. That, in fact, is a fundamental tenet of drug development. We like to know what is the cause, what is the effect, and what is the mechanism by which this works, in order to be able to develop something technically that maybe can stop the process. So what I wanted to do in this particular case was to see what is the mechanism by which protein causes cancer. So we looked at different mechanisms during the first stage. I said, okay, maybe protein activates the carcinogen and enable it to be able to cause a mutation. So we looked for mechanisms, and here you can see a series of mechanisms. I don't want to get into the details of these. This was an extensive amount of research where we were looking at enzyme activities. In this particular case, one enzyme in particular called the mixed function oxidase that tends to activate all kinds of chemicals to cause cancer. So we wanted to know what effect did protein have on the synthesis of that enzyme. We wanted to know what effect it might have on the activation of that enzyme such that it could actually do its work. We wanted to know the extent to which the carcinogen that's produced could bind to the DNA and therefore cause a mutation in the DNA, mutation, of course, in the genes. So we looked for different mechanisms, and here was the point. Every time we attempted to identify the mechanism responsible for this effect, we found one. It was frustrating. I couldn't put my finger on which mechanism was the most important. So then we said, okay, let's go to the second stage and see what mechanism, maybe the mechanism is there. Again, we started looking at the effect of the nutrients, or the protein in this particular case, on various mechanisms during the second stage. And you can see, again, every time we look for a mechanism, or the mechanism, every time we look for one, we essentially found one. For a while, that, as I say, was frustrating. It was a very interesting opportunity to train graduate students in doing research, because each one of these usually involved a graduate student working on their project for maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years, because it's very complicated about chemistry. But what then occurred to me at this particular point in time, there is no such thing as the mechanism. When something happens, like protein consumption causing a response, it doesn't happen by a single mechanism. And this holds true for a lot of different nutrients causing a lot of different disease outcomes. The mechanisms, there's a whole host of mechanisms, almost maybe countless in numbers, that tend to all sort of converge to create the response that occurs. This is a very exciting idea for me because it basically challenged, as I say, the fundamental tenets of what drug development is all about, and also suggested a way of nutrition working that's very complex, and yet it produces a very straightforward response when done the right way. So another lesson, nutrients act by not one, but by countless mechanisms, as if it were a symphony. As if it were a symphony. Just think about that. That's an exciting concept. When it comes into our bodies, everything starts to change in a really integrated way in which we have a symphony instead of a single instrument or a single key, to produce the response. So then we turned our attention to yet another consideration of this. I wanted to know which level of protein might cause this kind of response, and so we did this experiment here. What you can see is that when the protein was fed up to about 10% of total calories, it did not cause the cancer to grow, even though the cancer seeds were there. So the cancer seeds are there, it can grow, but it did not grow up until about 10% protein. What that says is this: protein is an essential nutrient. We need protein, no question about it. But the question is, if we go beyond what we need, that's what seems to relate to the idea. We go beyond this 10% level, and we get cancer growth. That shape of that curve is very similar to shapes of similar curves for other nutrients and other kinds of responses. We have a normal range of nutrient intake that does good things. It creates health. But when we go beyond or go in excess of the amount we need, or we don't have enough, that's when we have the difficulties. So this was, again, an exciting proposition. What does this really mean in a larger context for other nutrients besides protein? It turns out that we humans, if I put on this and ask myself, well, what level of protein do we usually consume in our human diet? And incidentally, humans need about the same amount of protein as do experimental animals. So they're kind of comparable. It turns out the human experience is that we are consuming not people here in this room, I think, for the most part, but most people are consuming levels of protein between about 10 or 11% up to maybe as much as 25%. So we humans are living in the danger zone, if you will. At least that's what this suggests. And maybe if we get too much protein, we're going to have problems. At least that's is really what this experiment suggested. So we have another lesson that over time I came to believe was a fundamental sort of principle of the way in which nutrients work, especially for protein. Protein is both essential, yes, it's essential, but it also can be problematic if fed too high. It reminded me, in fact, of an old statement made by a famous doctor here in Europe by the name of Paracelsus back in the 14th century. He said, for example, it is the dose that makes the poison. So all kinds of chemicals, there's oftentimes a range within which damage does not occur. And then there's a range beyond which damage can occur. And so this was sort of the same kind of idea. So I wanted to take this curve, this scheme, this graph. I wanted to take this graph and extend it to a broader consideration of not just cancer, but also to consideration of other health outcomes, other diseases. I wanted to also take this to the question concerning what about other nutrients as well? It's not just protein. So in an attempt to do that, I'm showing here the relationship between protein intake, in this particular case, protein intake, and the adverse health effects on the y-axis. You know, they being different kinds of diseases, let's say, for example. And so I'm labeling this dietary protein and general health, looking at a broader context of what's going on. I want to show you something here because it turns out that this is a very significant event that we have missed in science, and I'm not sure the public understands this also. But for me, it explains a lot. So it allows us to step on that bridge, going from science into something that's practical. Let me first describe to you how much protein do we really need, us humans? How much protein do we need? Well, it turns out about 75 years ago, it was determined that the amount of protein that we had to have, the minimum level, was around somewhere around 5-6% or so. That's the amount of protein that we need. That was established first time, officially at least, in 1943. And it's been revisited at least 14 times officially ever since then, every 5 years. So scientists get together, they look at this number again, they have decided, so this is pretty close to being fact, that the amount of protein that we need is around 4, 5, 6%. That's the minimum intake. When you do an experiment that way, though, I should tell you, you have a group of people, you determine what the result is, you get a mean. Now you want to know, well, maybe we should set that number a little higher to make sure the larger population has enough protein. So what science did with that minimum number was to add to it two standard deviations. When they did that, they came up with this number here called the recommended dietary allowance, the RDA that many of you may be familiar with. So the recommended dietary allowance for protein is a number that actually theoretically says that at least 98% of the population will have their protein needs met. What does that number turn out to be? The amount of protein that is recommended for everyone to make sure everyone has enough protein, the amount of protein recommended is around 9 or 10% of total calories. Around 9%, 10%. That number turns out to be very interesting because if you look on this chart here, going up to this level here, in other words, this level of protein here is fine, it's good, it's ideal. Protein is doing good work and serving our needs for health. When we exceed this level here, this is where we can if you will, imagine what can happen in terms, not just in terms of turning on cancer, but also in terms of causing some other diseases as well, such as increasing blood cholesterol levels or increasing the early stages of heart disease or increasing other kinds of problems as we exceed protein. The reason I'm focusing on protein here is not just because we were working with protein, but I should tell you just a little bit about the history. Protein was discovered in 1839 in Holland by a Dutch chemist. When it was first discovered as a nitrogen-containing substance, they had to have a name for it. And they took the name from the Greek word proteos, which means protein. It meant actually of prime importance. And so protein started out with a name that says of prime importance. In those days, protein was considered only to be from animal-based foods. After that, it was discovered that protein is in plant-based foods too. So through the years, a lot of people, and still today, think that protein means meat. And we have had this tremendous desire to make sure we get enough protein. What that means is we've had this desire as a collective body, we've had this desire to actually make sure we get enough protein. That means more meat, more dairy, more eggs, because that's really a good source of protein. Okay, now having said that, so the protein, our thinking about protein has in many ways driven our views about nutrition in general, whether we know it or not. Collectively, that's what we do. We tend to think we have to have enough protein. So let's have a look what happens in that particular case. To get the ideal level of protein, you can just consume a diet made up of plants. That's perfect. If you mix plants, vegetables, and fruits, and grains, and legumes, that kind of diet has exactly the right amount of protein. It meets our needs, according to this representation here. However, most of us, because we want to have more protein, we get that by consuming some animal-based food. So let's see what happens when that happens. Let's say we increase the animal-based food a little bit, not very much. So now we have, let's say in theory, 10 or maybe 11% protein total. But when we start doing that, what we're doing is we're actually beginning to decrease the consumption of plant protein. The reason for that being the total amount of calories we consume. I can't get into the details of that argument, but basically this is what happens. As we increase the total intake of protein, we're actually increasing animal-based protein, subtracting plant-based protein. So then we, let's say, put more in, as most of us do. Now we're consuming protein up to a level of maybe 14, 15%. Now we've got quite a lot of animal-based foods in our diet. The average level of protein intake in the United States, and I suspect here in Lithuania as well, the average level of protein is around 17 to 18%. You know, in Western societies, we are virtually carnivores. We consume a lot of protein. So let's see what that looks like. Now we're consuming really high levels of protein. Some of us might get up as high as 20 or 20% or more protein. When that happens, just to get the protein, we have now really cut into the plant protein component. When we do that, not only are we subtracting plant protein from the equation, we're also causing many other changes, many other nutrient changes as well. Let's have a look at what those other changes are. Okay, I listed here just another lesson for us, increasing protein consumption beyond about 10%, increasing it by consuming animal-based foods, by the way. It decreases the consumption of plant-based nutrients. So now, let's have a look to see what plants have by way of nutrients. Here's a chart showing, for example, for 5 different groups of nutrients. Antioxidants, and I would suggest, by the way, that of all the nutrient groups, I would suggest if there is a most important group of nutrients, it's antioxidants. They block the oxidation that goes on in our tissues that gives rise to what we refer to as oxygen-free radicals or reactive oxygen radicals that tend to encourage aging, that tend to actually promote cancer development, that tend to promote heart disease. So antioxidants are really important. They're only made in plants. Animals don't really make any significant amount of antioxidants. Complex carbohydrates, the chief source of our energy, is only made in plants, not in animals. Vitamins, according to the classical definition of vitamins, I should add, vitamins are only made in plants. One, by vitamin B12 is made of microorganisms, but basically vitamins are made in plants. So here we have a big difference. Plants do one thing nutritionally, animal foods do something different. They're very, very different. So now I think you can appreciate, as we increase the consumption of animal-based foods, we are really changing the nutrient composition of our diet. And it's the nutrient composition of our diet that primarily determines the health outcome or the disease outcome. Okay, so one additional comment. Both plant foods and animal foods, both groups have fat and protein. They both have fat, they both have protein. But animal-based foods have more fat on average than do plants. Animal-based foods have more protein than do plants. This is where we started getting into trouble. We want to consume that protein, and so as we do that, we're changing the composition of the whole diet. When we change the composition of the whole diet, that's when trouble begins. And so this is not just a question of protein alone. I want to emphasize that point. I learned this by using protein, but in reality, the much more important characteristic of this is the total dietary nutrient composition that really matters. Processed foods. These are foods that, as you may know, are made up. We use parts of plants even. We use maybe sugar. Sugar comes from plants. We use other kinds of refined carbohydrates, such as white flour, something less than whole flour. So we use some material from plants. Maybe we use some oil from plants because we think it's better. And we use other things, maybe from the animals. We use chemicals from other sources. We mix it all together, and we have usually products that are very high in fat, very high in salt, and very high in refined carbohydrates, sugar and white flour. We might end up, for example, with a donut or Danish made out of plants, materials. That's not what I'm talking about, obviously. So processed foods are those foods that have been concocted into a mixture so it appeals to our taste. But by doing this, we're getting away from consuming whole plant-based foods. So let me summarize quickly. We got three groups of foods as I see it. We got animal foods, we got processed foods, and we got plant foods. The animal foods and the processed foods have problems. And I could spend the rest of my time talking about the hazards of consuming those foods. And we could worry about this and get concerned about this. I'd rather talk about the positive message rather than negative message. And so the positive message is to focus on plant foods, and I also like to say whole plant-based foods. Not the parts, but the whole. So this is what gives rise to the concept of whole plant-based foods. At this particular point in time in some of my research, I was involved in helping to organize, we organized a nationwide study of a human population in rural China. This is the first research that was done between the United States and China after our two countries started to talk to each other again in the early 1980s. The Chinese at that time had established that for different cancers around the country, that it was very concentrated in some counties and not in others. They went across the country in the 1970s and determine how much cancer existed in 2,400 counties. And they found out that when they published this as atlases, as maps, the cancer was very common in some counties and much less common in other counties. At that time, in the early 1980s, I had the first senior scientist from China visiting my laboratory at Cornell University, Dr. Chen Zhe. And he and I, Dr. Chen was pretty high up in the government structure and science, he and I then decided to do a study, to go to China to see why is breast cancer, why is colon cancer, why is heart disease, why is it so common here and not there? It was a beautiful opportunity to learn something about this, especially for me because most of the rural Chinese are consuming pretty close to plant-based foods. Not enough, they'd have problems, but nonetheless it was sort of plant-based food. So we did the study in China, collected a massive amount of information. It became the most comprehensive study of its kind ever in the history of medicine. It involved 24 laboratories from around the world. And I'll just show you a quick summary here of some of the more important features. First off, cancers are geographically clustered, and we already knew then that if people move from this risk area of the world to this risk area of the world where the risk is different, people get the risk of the disease to which they move. So we had that in our minds based on other research, and so we knew that in China, people tend to live, and we established this, they tend to live in the same places where they're born, and they use locally produced food. And so they have these different rates of getting the disease. We collected lots of information, ended up about 367 so-called variables, diseases, and of various kinds. We collected blood samples and urine samples and food samples, and we did questionnaires. We collected a massive amount of information because at this point, I'm interested in knowing something more than just protein. I want to know if there were patterns of nutrient intake and patterns of dietary composition that might relate to the amount of diseases we see. And it turned out to be very promising in that regard. So we investigated patterns. We did not look at individual correlations. Causal correlation doesn't lead to causation, but in any case, we looked at patterns. And so after we finished this study, and incidentally, the study was organized from Cornell University. It included the University of Oxford in England, was a chief partner, and also 2 academies in China. So it was a joint project between our various institutions. And here are basically the main conclusions drawn from that study. Namely, it says, after looking at 50 or so different kinds of comparisons like fiber versus colon cancer, or maybe hormones versus breast cancer and so forth and so on. After looking at all these individual parts, we had this conclusion here. Within explanatory models of interpretation, the statistically significant majority of correlations favored less disease when the diets were composed of plant-based foods. When the nutrient composition approximated, or more closely approximated, the kind of nutrient composition you would see with plant-based foods, it was associated with less disease across the board. Very exciting finding. The practical advice is that consuming a whole food plant-based diet or whole plant-based foods, less total protein, less fat, no animal protein, that's when we saw the least amount of chronic degenerative diseases. That means cancer, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and so forth, the kind of diseases that we see that are common. And this was consistent. This was consistent with our experimental animal studies. I want to make this point here too clear. The China study standing alone did not give me the conclusion I have. I did not depend on the China study to get the ideas I now have. As you can tell, most of the ideas I had were done in experimental settings in the laboratory. The China study was valuable in the sense that it gave us an opportunity to see what we learned in the laboratory and what others were doing in other laboratories to see whether or not this applied to human population. So in that case, the two were consistent. Very nice. So then, at this particular point in time, especially when I got around to writing the book, the first book, the China study, to see if we could tell a story about all of this very complex information, I wrote this with my son, my youngest son, who at the time was in theater. He was an actor on stage in Chicago. And he came back because he was a good writer, and he worked with me to do the book. He got so excited about this area of work, he decided to change his career. And he went back to medical school, got his medical degree, has finished up his residency, and now is a physician on the University of Rochester Medical Center faculty, and also working with me too. It was a younger son. But in any case, the China study, when we were writing that study, I wanted to know, I knew something about cancer, I knew something about heart disease, I wanted to go into the scientific literature to see if there were maybe other diseases that might sort of hold true with the same idea. So here, you can see a list of all the diseases, and this is only a partial list. Taking all these diseases here, there is actually published evidence in the scientific literature, some of it rather old, but there's actually publications showing that a whole food, plant-based diet prevents, suspends, that means stop the progression of certain diseases. It prevents, it suspends, and or cures all these diseases. Doesn't mean that all the diseases are cured. It simply says prevents, suspends, and or cures all these different diseases. I found this fascinating. There's so many different kinds of diseases, some very serious, could actually be sort of addressed this way. So it led to another lesson. The whole food plant-based diet nutritional effect is broad. It involves a whole broad spectrum of diseases. Now we're much beyond cancer. We're talking about all kinds of outcomes. Then there's one more characteristic I want to mention to you that it turns out, and I'll show you some evidence in a moment. Consuming a whole food plant-based diet, as was advocated and is advocated in the Hippocrates formula, if you will, among other groups, that particular approach, using that kind of diet, not only addresses problems quickly, it addresses a broad spectrum of problems, it does so rather quickly. Here's evidence of this published in actually it was done in the late 1970s and 1980s. Some research done in Italy and Denmark, who were collaborating at the time. What this shows here, and I want to show you this, is that it illustrates a point. Namely, if we take a group of people, these researchers took a group of people who started out with pretty high cholesterol levels, 290 milligrams per deciliter. You need to translate that for Lithuanian experience, but around 290. If they put them on a low-fat diet, the cholesterol comes down a little bit. Cholesterol is important because of the indication of heart disease risk. But the big change they got was when they switched from the typical Western protein source over to a soy protein, a plant-based thing. Then the cholesterol really dropped, especially in this group here who started out a little lower. The cholesterol comes down a little bit. They switch the protein. It comes down to much lower levels. It says something. What this says is that switching to a plant-based source of the protein in this particular case, part of a whole diet, that's when they see the real decrease occurring, really substantial decrease. It's very exciting. And of course, when they switch back again to the typical so-called low-fat diet, but now animal-based foods, it started going back up. So they were seeing in this human population the same thing we were seeing in animal studies. You could turn on and turn off the development of cholesterol. And from the earlier literature, it shows you can turn on and turn off heart disease simply by changing the diet. It's a very, very exciting concept. So we have another lesson. The nutrient effect is rapid. It's broad in scope, but it's rapid too. And we can see changes occurring rather quickly. Then it came to my attention of my good friend, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, a famous surgeon at the Cleveland Clinic in the United States, who on his own, we did not know each other at that time. Dr. Esselstyn, working with patients, he's a doctor. He had been operating on people with heart disease and other problems. He's a surgeon, and he basically thought, for his own reasons, that maybe feeding them a certain kind of diet might be better than thinking about surgery and treating them with chemicals. So he started out in this study with 18 patients who were seriously ill with heart disease. 18 patients. And he put them on an all-food, whole plant-based diet. He did use, in the very beginning, low-dose statins, but the results that he got were entirely attributed to the dietary effect, as he was able to show a little later. So this is a dietary effect. These 18 patients had had 49 coronary events in the 8 years before they got in the study. 49 coronary events. This tells you these 18 people were really sick with heart disease. They had on an average about 3 heart attacks or other events like that in the 8 years prior to that. They went from 49 coronary events prior to the study to 0 over the next 12 years. That's remarkable. There's no drug, none, not even the combination of all drugs that could even come close to do that kind of thing. One individual did actually, during that period of time, did have a coronary event, but that was because that person had strayed from the diet. So it started using the typical Western diet. So what Dr. Esselstyn was able to show is that this same remarkable effect occurred for a plant-based diet. That was published after 12 years. Now we've had 27 years to look back at those results. And it turns out, of those 18 people, 5, the last time I heard, 5 of these people had passed away, but not from coronary heart disease. Still today, 27 years later, as long as they stayed on the diet, heart disease problems did not reoccur. Also, at the same time, he hasn't published this, but this particular group of people have a cancer rate only 10% of what is otherwise expected. It's a small study. It's a small study. But now Dr. Esselstyn has a much larger collection of information he's going to be publishing soon. And I can tell you it just reaffirms what, in fact, he found in the first. So what Dr. Esselstyn had done, the conclusion he was drawing was the same conclusions I was drawing from the laboratory. It's really quite interesting. You do it this way, we did not know each other, and yet we were getting the same results. Now I want to turn your attention in the last few slides to something about, unfortunately I don't have my slides right. Oh, here we go. I want to tell you something about the way nutrition works. This is something that people don't tend to know. When we consume food, and the nutrients are released from the food in our intestine, there's some things that go on that's very interesting. It shows what the body really is doing. For example, when we come in, the food gets digested. That means the body is deciding what percent of the total nutrient in that food should be released in the intestine so it can get absorbed. Let's call that digestion. The body actually varies the amount that it wants. I mean, the amount of food that actually is digested, the amount of nutrients that are digested from the food, varies from maybe 10% of the total to, who knows, 20, 30, 40% of the total. It varies depending on the conditions. Then at that particular point in time, the food is then absorbed across the intestinal wall to get into the blood. Again, the body adjusts that. How much should be absorbed? First, how much should be digested, and then of the stuff that's digested, how much should be absorbed, and then it gets into the blood. It's transported in the blood, in many cases, either being active or inactive. The body is actually adjusting that. Then it goes to various organs, liver, pancreas, lung, whatever. The body's choosing how much to send here, how much to send there, and so forth, according to the needs of the body at that point in time. And then it gets inside of cells, crosses into the cells, and then it enters into an enormously complex system of reaction pathways, biochemical reaction pathways. Some of those pathways lead to products that actually promote health. Some of those products may lead to products that need to be excreted. Some of them are used to actually create some functions. Then, of course, the body decides on how much to store, and then how much to excrete. Here's my point. Throughout this system, we cannot know when we consume a certain amount of nutrient in the beginning, we have no idea what portion of that nutrient here consumed reaches the site where it's going to work. There's virtually very little or no relationship. We can't tell that. So we spend a lot of time in science worrying about, should we have 10 milligrams of this or 30 milligrams of that, when in fact it doesn't really make any difference. All we need to do is just to consume food that generally has the right amount. The body does the rest. The infinite wisdom of the body to choose how much each individual nutrient is needed is very, very impressive. We've forgotten that in science. We have forgotten what the body can do. We just need to let it do it. And so our choice is only just to choose those foods that in general have the right amount of nutrients and let the body do the rest. We don't need to get caught up in so much of the detailed mechanisms to do this. And so the body adjusts the amount of nutrient passing through each stage. Therefore, there's no way we can know how much of a food nutrient is available at the functional site. I'd ask you just to think about this, because it tends to steer us away from the specific amounts of nutrients that we tend to worry about, think about, and allows us to start thinking about what does the body do. And let's just choose the right foods and let the body do the rest. It works much better. I saw this, or became really particularly aware of this, when I was doing research early in my career involving the intracellular biochemistry. That was my training and my background to some extent. And I can tell you that each cell in our body is just an awesome display of nature at work. Here's a picture of a cell here that's got different parts to it, as you can see. I mean, we have nuclei, we have mitochondria, we have Golgi apparatus, we have all these different things inside of a cell. I'll tell you something about that in a moment. It's just think about, we have these cells. Actually, we have between 10 and 100 trillion cells in our body. That's a number we can't even imagine. And so what can we say about these cells? Well, each cell we can't see unless we look at it under a microscope. To the naked eye, we can't see the cell. It's not visible. But each cell is so small that it can sit comfortably on the head of a pin. So we're talking about very, very, very tiny little bodies. We call them cells. And inside of the cell, we have this enormously complex arrangement of architecture and particulate matter and biochemistry going on, all inside of this cell. It's really awesome. Here, for example, in the nucleus, we've got the DNA, where everything starts. The DNA itself is a long chain of bases that give rise to various combinations of genes that can give us a whole variety of different health outcomes. Usually what they produce is the protein, and the protein then becomes an enzyme, and so we have almost an infinite numbers of different kinds of enzymes in every cell. Somebody said 100,000 different enzymes. I think it's more. It's far more than that when you think about the activity of enzymes. So inside of every cell, it's a universe unto itself. Inside of every cell, even in the distance between different things, it's like looking out at the universe. We have this enormous world of just one cell. We can't even see it. So we have all this stuff going on. All the DNA is laid out here. And so different cells, this cell over here might decide to make insulin from that same DNA strand. This cell over here has the same DNA strand, but it might choose to make something different. And so every cell has this wisdom of choosing what it wants to, how it wants to use that DNA template, what it wants to make. The DNA chain itself, inside of the nucleus of every cell, if you stretch out all this long chain, is equivalent to something like 1.8 miles is the strand inside of a cell we can't even see. I mean, just try to think about that. I mean, I think this is so awesome to realize that here is this complexity, this enormous complexity inside the cell. But here's the kicker. Here's the sort of final point I want to make, and that is inside this complexity, we can't manage it. We cannot be engineers to try to arrange all this and decide, when this happens, when that happens, what to put here, what to point there. We cannot do that with any degree of accuracy. We've really got to rely on the cell. We've got to rely on nature, to choose what it wants to do. All we need to do is to provide it the food that basically it can best use without having to worry about the toxic effects that might occur. Now, as I said, the DNA produces enzymes. And if you think it was complicated, what I just told you, complex, think of this. There are, as I said, according to some estimates, 100,000 different kinds of enzymes in every cell. I think there's more. Here's a picture of an enzyme. This is an enzyme that's made up of amino acids. You can stretch them all out on a chain. And every enzyme is different depending on the combination of amino acids. You put the enzyme together, they start having some affinity for each other, so it becomes a three-dimensional structure. That three-dimensional structure, in the finest detail, actually just change the structure a little bit. Just change the structure a little bit can change the activity of that enzyme to catalyze a reaction going from A to B to C. And the body is changing this within microseconds, within nanoseconds. Those enzymes are working to actually create the symphony I'm talking about. And so we end up with a system that is out there in space almost, but actually in our bodies, in these very tiny little instruments that do things. Now, for me, that tells me why we get such remarkable effects when we feed the right food. That's why Dr. Esselstyn was able to cure heart disease. That's why we could turn on and turn off cancer experimentally. That's why we can actually reduce diabetes. That's why it happens so fast. We do the right thing, we're going to get the right results. So I've been associated with some attempts to take people and put them in a program, feed them the right food to see what happens. My oldest son is doing this, and I want to show you some results of his doing this for 10 days. He gets a group of people together. In this case, in this particular study here, he had 16 people, everyday people. Nothing particularly wrong with them. They mostly thought they were quite healthy. They decided to eat the food that he gave to them. And the food, most importantly, was tasty. This food that he now has been tested extensively on taste panels, so it's a tasty food. I'm interested in actually creating a model so that average people out there can enjoy the kind of thing that I know that many of you already know. So he has this tasty food. He puts the people into a 10-day program. Whole food, plant-based diets, essentially. And here's what happens. In 10 days, just 10 days, the body weight loss is 5 to 10 pounds. I know that you know this. I know that you, with some of these experiences, know this well. But what he's trying to do, what I'm trying to do, is to demonstrate to our friends who tend not to know this or don't really understand it. So they lose 8 to 10 pounds of body weight. The cholesterol goes down from 196 to 148 in 10 days. That's remarkable. In cholesterol units here in Lithuania, that would be from 5 to 3.8 nanomoles per liter. LDL cholesterol, the bad kind, goes from 118 to 186. Just again, a remarkable change. Triglycerides also dropped rather substantially. That's a big change. In 10 days, a whole food, plant-based diet, in people who already were reasonably healthy according to the standards. They had average cholesterol levels of 196. That's lower than the average. They thought they were healthy, but they saw this. So it suggests that the vast majority of people are not as healthy as they think they are. They can gain a lot of things. Now I'm going to finish up just making a few remarks what this means, because I think we need to think to the future. We can look at the past. We look at the past and we see things went on in the past. We ignored it. We continue to ignore it these days in the modern day. Here's a statement from a book written by a Cambridge University faculty member that I found very interesting. He was writing about vegetarianism. That word didn't exist in those days, but anyhow, he's using the word to explain the results. And he said the late 18th century and the 1700s was the heyday of medical vegetarianism, and it flourished in the most prestigious medical faculties of Europe. So here you are in Europe. You know, we knew this that long ago, 2 or 3 centuries ago, with the information they had in those days. They still had arrived at this particular point of view. It leads me then to comment on the fact that we've known this for a lot longer than just the 1700s. Hippocrates said this: we are what we eat. An old aphorism that's been around for a long time in our history books. Aristotle presumably is the person who said this, I'm not sure, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that's the idea. It's the whole, everything operating together, the whole. That's what's important. If you look inside the cell, we can learn so many lessons about the way we can conduct our own lives, not just as if we were a cell. But you see this sort of integration of things all the way up the hierarchy. And then Hippocrates. That is the basis for what Anne Wigmore was talking about too. Hippocrates said, let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food. All this out here in the front of you here is obviously not just food. It's not just something. It's just enlarged. It's concentrated with almost infinite different kinds of nutrients that when you consume those, they decide to work together. The body decides that. So this is, I would say, is what's called echoes from 2,500 years ago. We're now just getting around to rediscovering what this is about, maybe using modern techniques, modern science, to establish this idea. And I would suggest we don't have another 2,500 years to relearn this lesson. We've got to acknowledge it now. We need to know what is possible, and we need to put it into practice. One final thing. What we choose to eat does more than just make us healthy, each of us as individuals. It helps us to make our families and our friends healthy. It helps us to make whole societies healthy. The ramifications of choosing the right food to eat is extremely important. And I've just listed here some things that come from our, I suggest, misunderstanding of nutrition. Misunderstanding of nutrition. I put quotes around it. You can see the quotes I've used. And I think you see the point. We misunderstand nutrition. And by doing so, we compromise our personal health. We degrade our environment. That's a big story that's now just beginning to emerge. Raising all the livestock in the world, quite frankly, according to people working with the World Bank, friends of mine, raising the livestock we do actually is the main contributor to global warming. It's spectacular. It doesn't involve just carbon dioxide. It involves other gases like methane and nitrous oxide, which are more significant in many ways. It leads to excessive medical costs. Big problem in the United States. It's breaking our bank, essentially. It leads to unnecessary violence in the world. The idea that we need to go put livestock here, put it there, cause deforestation, erode the land, and the wars and conflicts that arise over doing that kind of thing. Whoops, so sorry about that. And so we also, what I'm saying here too, and I know this from being in science, we use the wrong kind of tools and the wrong kind of experiments to create information and mislead the public. And so we've got to, in science, we've got to clean up our shop and actually redesign some of the kind of ideas that we have for what we are actually doing. We also have problems with policy corruption. I have served for about 20 years. I was on national and international policy boards on food and health. I know that firsthand from that firsthand experience, that what is happening within this system, of which we are all a part, within this system, it turns out the corporate sector, making the foods, making the drugs, have enormous control of what we think. And you'd be surprised how powerful is that force. I do not want to question their role, what they are doing. I happen to be strongly in support of the free market system. I'm simply saying that so that's understood. All I'm saying is a totality of the thing that we all are part of. We've got to become aware, and as individuals, we start demanding and tell what we know, so we can actually create the opportunity for the production of different kinds of products and services that would give us all a better life. And here are 3 books that I have been involved with. This first one, the China study, I've done with my son. The second one is a daughter. Okay. The second one is our daughter who, she's in education actually, but she published a book just recently, the China Study Cookbook, with recipes from her own kitchen as well as from my wife's kitchen. So there it is, China Study Cookbook. And the third one is Whole. And I just came here to Lithuania 2 days ago and was given this copy here. This is the first foreign translation of Whole here in Lithuania. I really appreciate that. The China study itself has been translated into about 30 different languages, I think, by now, something like that. But I'm really delighted to know that it really seems to be catching on, because I think now we have enough information to make good decisions for ourselves and for our friends and family, for society, and for the planet at large. Thank you very much. Okay.
Hello. Thank you very much for your fantastic speech and for your trip here to Lithuania. And we would like actually to present a very short movie, Pavlai, a very short movie about the cell. So can we just look for 2 minutes about the metabolism of the cell? Jeigu šviesą čia truputį sumažintumėt mums. Čia yra iš tikrųjų ir ląstelės vidinių procesų.
Here you see what is happening within the cell.
So you can sort of guess what they might be, but what you see here is 3-dimensional structures, all sort of related to each other, and there's communication going on between these different structures. They tend to talk to each other. And so when something happens to something up on the left, what's happening down here on the right knows about it. I mean, if you think about the wisdom in a cell, here is displayed. Oops, I got that right. The wisdom of the cell, the wisdom of the body is actually deciding on how to do things better than our brains can actually comprehend. All we need to do is look at the symphony, listen to it. And do the
whole symphony of our cell.
Yeah. So I don't know the parts of each of those things there. I mean, I can guess that's the long line of endoplasmic reticulum, if you know in science. We can guess that, and other kinds of, that looks a little bit like DNA, maybe a protein structure along there, sort of dividing and doing different things. Yeah, we got tubes, they have tubules, in the cell. They form and things travel in those tubules and they send communications down the channel, and this is probably DNA some of it is parting and making new DNA for the new cell, and I'm guessing at some of this. I don't know because you're not telling me. Every cell is like a universe. Just think of the dimensions of this. The distance between things actually are enormous when you take into consideration the distance from, let's say, an electron to a proton in the nucleus of just an atom.
So this is the actual movie. It's not animation. It's a real movie. They photograph now this and make a movie.
That's right. That's right. It's very good. I hadn't seen this before. It's very nice. You can just imagine how those things are talking to each other. And it all is happening within nanoseconds. Just imagine you're sitting there. I'm standing here. Just imagine this is going on in something like 10 to 100 trillion cells in our body simultaneously.
So we are talking that we can understand the immune system, how it works. So, but basically maybe we know a couple of % what is in reality happening there in the cell.
It really is pretty amazing. I can only wonder, I look at the cell and I know how cells talk to each other, and all the cells are trying to always create health. And I'm just wondering, where did we go astray? If we look at our cells, what they do, always capable of dealing with adversity and trying to create health and working together. And the same happens with different organs like liver and pancreas and lung talking to each other. You see the same thing all the way through. Our bodies are always trying to create health. Why can't we as individuals relate to each other that same way? So we are, in fact, have this sort of wholesome sort of relationship with each other. Why can't we as ethnic groups or countries or societies, why can't we also work the same way? In sort of a wholesome sort of fashion. If we could just represent, looking at the cell, we can all do that at different levels. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Campbell. Thank you very much. Aš norėčiau pasakyti, kad mes čia kairėje pusėje.
Here on the left, we will have questions and answers.
Yeah, it was our course.
Yes, they will just switch on the
because that's what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. You'd like to get back to your presentation?
Can you get that last slide? I forgot that. Sorry about that.
Taigi mes čia galite viršuje irgi pasistengsim atnešti klausimus ir atsakymus. Tai bandykim parašyti klausimus ir galite paimti.
You are welcome to write your questions on pieces of paper and we will try to sort them and answer to your questions.
I tell this opportunity, we have created a foundation I have now, now run by my youngest son. We have partnered with Cornell University. It's a part of Cornell called eCornell. We partnered with them, creating a course in plant-based nutrition. And so we now are able to offer professional credits, continuing medical education credits to doctors and to medical students. It's turned out to be very successful. We're very excited about it in case any of you might be interested. This is a nonprofit opportunity, a nonprofit organization. And Cornell now is offering 200 courses altogether. We're number one of the 200. So it's really taken off. And I'm here, in fact, in Lithuania at the present time, talking thanks to Paulius and Petrus made arrangements for me to meet with some of the authorities here in this country to talk about how this course might be used, in the training of medical students here as well. The majority of my lectures now are to medical schools in the United States and elsewhere. And so it's very exciting to have your participation. So thank you about that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your speech. So